Hey there everyone. In the year I've been running the channel, I've only really ever looked at processors from the circuit 775 era, but as I finally managed to get my hands on some DDR3, it's time for something a bit newer. The Pentium G850 from the Sandy Bridge line of processors was launched back in May 2011 and is a dual-core CPU with no hyperthreading and a TDP of 65 watts for the 1155 socket. It ran at 2.9 GHz with 3 MB of L3 cache and supported DDR3 RAM at a maximum speed of 1333 MHz. Faster RAM will work, it will just run no higher than 1333 MHz. It featured 504 million transistors built on the 32nm fabrication process. It also had integrated graphics, but for this video we don't really care about that. Price-wise, Intel launched the G850 at $86 before any taxes in the US, which today is around $96 adjusting for inflation, or around £74 or €87 also before taxes. However, I managed to pick it up for £2 at CEX here in the UK, but you can also buy it on eBay in America for as little as $2.37 at the time of writing. Today I'll be running the G850, both stock and with an overclock, through a couple of benchmarks and a few games as well, to give you an idea of how the G850 performs today. The rest of the system I'll be using for the test features an Asrock Z68 Pro3 motherboard, 8GB of DDR3 RAM running at the G850's maximum selectable frequency of 1333 MHz, a MSI GTX 1080 Armor OC Edition graphics card to eliminate any potential bottlenecks other than the G850 itself, Windows 7 Ultimate 64-bit, and the Phanteks TC14PE to keep the Pentium cool. First up for the benchmarks today is a favourite of mine, Cinebench R15. It's a benchmark also popular with extreme overclockers that is designed to test your processor's multi-core performance by rendering a photorealistic 3D scene. I ran the benchmarks 3 times and averaged them out to get a reliable and repeatable representation of the G850's performance. The Pentium G850 was never meant to be a high performer, so it's not going to score that high here, but at stock speeds it managed scores of 192, 192 and 193 for an average of 192.67, pretty much matching the performance of a Core 2 Duo E7400 overclocked to 3.675 GHz. Overclocking wise, and given that the G850's multiplier is locked, the only way to overclock it is to increase the base clock, which doesn't have that much wiggle room on Sandy Bridge unfortunately. Though I did manage to get 3.07 GHz out of the G850 with a base clock of 105.9 MHz. Which also put the RAM up to 1411.14 MHz. With this small increase in clocks came a small increase in score, with 204, 204 and 203 points for the 3 runs respectively, giving an average of 203.66, a 5.07% increase in score. Next up is the physics section of 3DMark's Firestrike benchmark, and like Cinebench, I ran the test 3 times and averaged out the score to get a reasonable representation of performance. At the G850's stock speed of 2.9 GHz, it managed scores of 2563, 2595 and 2623 for an average score of 2593.67, and with the small increase in clocks from 2.9 to 3.07 GHz, the G850 managed scores for its 3 runs of 2791, 2765 and 2797 for an average score of 2784.33, an increase of 7.35% over the stock score. First up for the games today is Grand Theft Auto 5, which initially released 6 years ago now, but didn't have its PC release until April 2015, and despite being 4 years old now, it is still massively popular and a great game to benchmark. I'm running the game at 1080p with the lowest settings possible using DirectX 11, at stock speeds and with the 3.07 GHz overclock. Despite only managing a 170 MHz overclock, the improvement was actually quite noticeable during my test. At stock, FPS in the city was around the low 20s up to the mid 40s, with some pretty noticeable micro stuttering throughout, whereas with the overclock, the FPS reached into the high 50s in the city at points and had no noticeable stuttering or locking up at all, and neither had any issues with input lag or locking either, which was nice as well. In a way, the game is kind of playable at points at stock clocks. It is however quite a jarring experience at times. The overclock though does go a long way to smoothing out the issues and overall provides a much more comfortable experience. It does still have its own issues with occasional brief micro stuttering though. The Fraps benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates, of 39, 18 and 11 frames per second respectively for stock clocks, with multiple spikes in frame times of around 60 milliseconds throughout the whole test, with some of around 120 to around 280 milliseconds at the worst. The overclock showed 45, 23 and 18 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. It did however show several spikes in frame times of around 50 to 80 milliseconds, with some as bad as around 100 to 370 milliseconds. Moving on to the second game in the test today, and it's CSGO, a game initially released in 2012 which has a massive professional scene and is still massively popular today. I'm running the game at 1080p with the lowest settings possible in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map, and given that I've managed to run CSGO on older Core 2 duos before, I was expecting at least reasonable enough performance to play the game. At stock clocks, FPS tended to be in the low 50s to around 110 frames per second, and even showed spikes to around 125 frames per second as well. The overclock though increased that performance further, with FPS in the high 60s to around 120 frames per second, with spikes as high as 150 frames per second being observed as well. Both were quite playable, however stock clocks showed some noticeable but brief locking up on a couple of occasions, with the overclock not appearing to have this issue at all. The lockups at stock, I noticed, appeared to happen when large groups of people, the whole team for example, were moving together. Stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 90, 54 and 40 frames per second respectively. But according to the frame time graph, there were some dips below 30 frames per second at times, and some spikes in frame times of around 80 to 100 milliseconds throughout the test. The overclocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 97, 55 and 43 frames per second respectively. It did show reduced stuttering over stock clocks, but did still have some spikes in frame times of around 55 to 80 milliseconds. Moving on to the next game in our test, and it's time for some Rise of the Tomb Raider, the second game in the rebooted Tomb Raider series. Stock clocks showed a fair amount of issues, which I was expecting given that the G850 was never meant for gaming anyway. Both showed some pretty long loading times, and stock clocks showed some very noticeable stuttering at points of the game, with FPS dipping to the low 20s at times. The overclock managed to improve on this a fair bit, but that however did still show some minor stuttering, but was a massive improvement over stock clocks. There was also one occasion at stock clocks in which there was a significant and complete lockup which lasted for a couple of seconds. The stuttering was pretty bad in the Soviet installation / copper mill area of the map at stock clocks, and there was also an issue where the interior of the wolf den took a few seconds more to render, which would cause you to fall through the map if you didn't notice it in time. The overclock showed no such issue with texture popping at all, however did still show some noticeable stuttering at times in the Soviet installation / copper mill area, but overall the stutter was massively reduced compared to what stock clocks managed. The benchmark for stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 49, 14 and only 8 frames per second respectively, and also showed some major spikes in frame times of around 1.1 to 2.2 seconds at the worst, with less major spikes of around 60 to 120 milliseconds throughout the test according to the frame time graph. The overclock on the other hand showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 53, 21 and 13 frames per second respectively. It also showed several spikes in frame times of around 40 to 100 milliseconds throughout the test, with some as bad as around 160 to 300 milliseconds. For the last game in the test today, it's on to a favourite of mine, Warframe, which released back in 2013 and is available through Steam or from the Warframe website itself. And like the previous 3 games, I'm running Warframe at 1080p with the lowest settings possible and a survival mission on Jupiter. Unlike what I was expecting, the game actually ran quite well at stock speeds and with an overclock. At stock, FPS on the lander craft sat between the mid 170s up to around 230 frames per second, and the overclock only improved on this, with figures between the low 180 frames per second range up to around 240 FPS. Neither showed any noticeable stuttering or locking up at all at this stage, and both ran smoothly on the planet selection screen. In the mission itself, FPS would hit as high as around 220 frames per second in the least detailed area, with no enemies around you at all, with the overclock showing a max in the mid 220s. During the mission though, stock clocks showed no noticeable stuttering or locking up at all, and showed FPS in the range of the high 60s to just below 110 frames per second. The overclock though managed to stick to around the high 80s up to the mid 120 frames per second range, and as you'd expect, given the performance of stock clocks, it showed no noticeable stuttering or locking up whatsoever. Both were pretty fun to play, and neither showed any noticeable issues at all, making for a pretty enjoyable experience in Warframe on the G850. Stock clocks showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 86, 50 and 42 frames per second respectively, with the overclock showing 94, 58 and 48 frames per second for its average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates respectively. There were no significant spikes in frame times in either test, and both showed only a couple of dips below 30 frames per second according to the frame time graph, which wasn't noticeable at all. Overall, I was quite excited to test something that wasn't the usual 775 processors that I test, which happened to be the easiest and cheapest for me to get my hands on, but instead test something a lot newer from the Sandy Bridge range on the 1155 socket. I was particularly impressed with how much of a difference in performance the overclock made. Despite only managing an extra 170 MHz over stock clocks, the G850's overclock smooths out a lot of the stuttering that I saw at stock, and manages to make games that require more powerful processors than itself semi-playable. Warframe and CSGO perform well enough to be playable even at stock clocks, and GTA 5 is kind of playable with an overclock as well. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and leaving a comment as well. I'd also really appreciate it if you could share this with anyone you think may enjoy it. If you'd like to support me in creating these videos, you could subscribe to my channel and maybe even consider supporting me through my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. You don't have to, but I'd be eternally grateful if you did. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.